Well, I thank you, Wade, for that introduction. Let me tell you, when you think about our country and the incentive structure for politicians in Washington, D.C., what you find is that members of Congress are keenly interested in getting reelected, and that requires them to fund their campaigns. And in many cases, what happens is politicians get to Washington, D.C., they meet a bunch of lobbyists on K Street, and those lobbyists, guess what? They know a lot of people that can help them fund their campaigns. What Heritage Action is doing, what Wade Miller and his crew, what they are doing is they are changing the incentive structure in Washington, D.C. to hold politicians accountable so that the incentive structure is no longer how do I fund my campaign, but how do I keep the grassroots happy? That's the incentive structure that is changing in Washington, D.C. because of Heritage Action. And Heritage, here's what I'm seeing now. Heritage Action and Club for Growth and Senate Conservatives Fund, Madison Project, a lot of these groups are coming together now, working with each other, but beyond that, they're coming to Tulsa, Oklahoma. They're working with Rhonda Smith with the 912 Project, and this is the exact kind of scenario that we have to develop if we're going to change the incentive structure in Washington, D.C. What I'm really pleased with this event is the fact that now we've got OCPA Impact, Americans for Prosperity, and the Tulsa 912 Project colluding to change the incentive structure here in the state of Oklahoma. So please give yourselves a hand. This is the kind of organization that we're going to need if we're going to be able to advance conservative principles here in our country and in our state. So what I was asked to talk about today, according to the agenda, is reining in federal government. And what I'd like to start off by talking about is, I'm under no illusions that politicians in Washington, D.C. are going to rein in federal power. It's just not going to happen that way. Politicians love power. It used to be they could hand out earmarks. There was a moratorium, largely because of efforts of folks like Senator Tom Coburn from here in the state of Oklahoma. But now, yeah, there you go. But now what you see with the moratorium on earmarks, you see something entirely new, where lobbyists are now going to Washington, D.C. To lobby for manipulations of the tax code. And we see that over and over. I don't know how many people have come into my office in Washington, D.C. to protect or advance some small manipulation of the tax code that, according to everybody who comes into my office, it's really quite insignificant when you look at the overall tax code. But if you line up all the people that come in and they want to manipulate the tax code, it ends up being a huge amount of money that people are trying to work into the tax code as far as special privileges and things. So one of the things that, I campaigned hard saying that I was for the fair tax, and I know there's a lot of fair tax folks here. One of the things I found is every time I talk about the fair tax, somebody else tells me about the flat tax. And when we talk about the flat tax, somebody says, no, we want the fair tax. Well, my thought was this. Let's start with where we all agree. We all agree that we need to repeal the 16th Amendment and eliminate the IRS. Let's start there. And if you look at the flat tax, the original flat tax, the Hall-Rabushka flat tax, this was created by the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, a conservative think tank. What it did is it taxed income, that's absolutely true, but it exempted income from investments. It exempted investments, period. Income from investments, capital gains, dividend taxes, the death tax, interest income. It exempted all of this, right? So when you get right down to it, the Hall-Rabushka flat tax, in essence, taxes the money that's left over that you use to consume things. It is, in essence, a consumption tax. And if you look at the fair tax, it too is a consumption tax. So I said, look, where do we all agree? Whether you're for the flat tax or whether you're for the fair tax, and look, I'm very clear, I'm for the fair tax, but that's a fight we should have another day. Right now, we should all get together, members of the House of Representatives, whether you're for the fair tax or the flat tax, we should come together and say, look, this IRS is egregious. They are punishing conservative groups. Now is the time. It's astonishing to me that the Republican Party has not capitalized on what the IRS has done. The IRS is targeting conservative groups. They are, and it's not just Tea Party groups. It's pro-life groups. It's pro-Israel groups. It's pro-Constitution groups. And here's what we know. Lois Lerner was, by direction, sending applications from conservative groups to the office in Washington, D.C. And from there, it went upstairs to the office of the chief counsel of the IRS. Only conservative groups have this treatment, and there was like 206 of these cases. Now, these applications, of course, were delayed. And this chief counsel of the IRS is one of 2 Barack Obama appointees. Now is the time when we need to say, the IRS is done. And the fair tax or the flat tax, either one, we need to repeal the 16th Amendment and eliminate the IRS. And this would be the biggest shift of federal power. And boy, I'll tell you what, K Street already lost their, they lost their earmarks. Now if they lost their ability to manipulate the tax code, the lobbyists would go out of business, and you would once again be represented the way you ought to be represented in Washington, D.C. So I would highly encourage everyone to go to repeal16.org, sign the petition at repeal16.org, email it to your friends in other districts, and have them reach out to their members of Congress. We need to get as many people on this as possible. We've got so far 10 co-sponsors. There's 72 co-sponsors on the fair tax. This is just one element of the fair tax, so all of them should get on it. And of course, people that are for the flat tax should be on this bill as well. Now, when you talk about this federal encroachment, one thing that everybody's aware of now is the overreach of the President of the United States. And he picks and chooses which laws he's going to enforce. By the way, that is not his constitutional obligation. His constitutional obligation is to faithfully execute the laws of the United States. When he can't pick and choose which laws to enforce, and he wants to create a law, he uses the bureaucracies. He uses his executive branch to create rules and regulation, to create law that didn't exist before. I'll give you a real quick example. You look at what's happening right now with the EPA shutting down coal-fired power plants, 2 in Oologah, which is affecting this district, where everybody here is going to have their rates hiked, because the EPA's, and they tried to pass this in the first 2 years of the president's presidency. They tried to do cap and trade. They tried to, have these carbon taxes. And at the end, it failed. And so then he uses the bureaucracies, he uses the EPA to create rules and regulations that ultimately accomplish the same objective, which is to punish the people in this district and anybody else who uses energy from coal-fired power plant. Let me be really clear. Who does this hurt the worst? It hurts the poor. The poor are the ones who pay the biggest percentage of their budgets on electricity. And they're the ones that are going to get punished in this. This is the president's war on the poor. So look, whether it's Obamacare, picking and choosing which parts of Obamacare to enforce, whether it's creating laws using rules and regulations from the bureaucracies, or using foreign bodies, as is the case with the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty. Now, the president tried to ban certain types of guns back in April, and the Senate rejected him. Then he said, you know what, and by the way, these guns, they didn't operate any differently than any other type of gun. They just looked scary. So they called them assault rifles, and we're going to ban those. And then, it didn't work. The Senate rejected it. So they said, okay, we're going to ban certain sizes of magazines. The Senate rejected that. Then they said, we're going to do universal background checks, which ends up being a national gun registry. The Senate rejected that. And then the president says, you know what, I can't get done what I want to get done, so I'm going to sign a treaty with the United Nations, the Arms Trade Treaty, so that anybody who has a gun that has any part made in a foreign country, there's going to be an international secretariat where you have to have a background check, and you're going to be signed up in an international gun registry because the president signed on to this. Now, here's the good thing. It's a treaty, which requires ratification by the Senate. The Senate has rejected that. Unfortunately, because this, let's get a clap for that. But this is the mentality of this president. He is going to advance his agenda, whether it's within the will of the American people or not. If he can't do it with Congress, if he can't do it using the executive branch, he will use foreign bodies to attempt to advance his agenda. So, a friend of mine from South Carolina, Congressman Tom Rice, he wrote a bill. He's an attorney. I know we've got too many attorneys in Washington, but he's a good one. And Tom Rice wrote a bill called the STOP Act. Stop this overreaching president. Now here's what's important to note. He wrote this bill probably maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago. We already have 106 co-sponsors on this bill. And here's what it does. It directs the House of Representatives to bring a lawsuit against the President of the United States to hold him accountable civilly for not enforcing the laws of our country. Now, Tom Rice brought that to me, and I couldn't grab a pen fast enough. And I'll be clear. He informs me that there is precedent for this. It's not required to pass the Senate. This is a House of Representatives suing the presidency of the United States. The challenge we have right now in Washington is you can't hold anybody in the Obama administration accountable because Harry Reid protects them. That's where we are. And so here is a way where we can, ensure that the president is enforcing the laws and will bring a civil lawsuit against him if he doesn't. So I want everybody to go to the STOP Act. Congressman Tom Rice, it's his website. I don't have a website address for you, but if you just Google Tom Rice, South Carolina, STOP Act, S-T-O-P, I think it's actually called Stop Resolution, not the STOP Act. But go to his website and talk to your member of Congress. If you're not from this district, talk to your member of Congress about getting on the STOP Act. It's a critically important piece of legislation. I've got about 5 minutes before I need to hit the door here, so I'm going to go through some things pretty quickly. One of the challenges that we have in our country right now is the debt to deficit. And as Wade talked about, it seems to me that Republicans have absolutely lost their will to fight to control federal spending. And that's what we saw just this week. Republicans got together with Democrats. They brought a bill to the floor to raise the debt ceiling clean. And at the end, the only people that lose are the taxpayers. And the challenge here is, how does this affect us and what do we do about it? Here's what's going to happen. The more we continue to raise the debt ceiling without providing a solution to control federal spending, we are doubling down on bad policy in this sense. And a lot of people in this room have heard me talk about this before. I'm going to continue talking about it because it's critically important. And if you haven't heard this before, you need to hear it. In this country, we are right now printing money to buy the bonds that fund the government. We print, we're buying, $65 billion worth of bonds every month at this point. So we, as Congress, we have this huge deficit, $1 trillion annually for 5 years, huge deficit. We've got to fund it. We've got to sell bonds. Americans aren't buying those bonds. The Chinese aren't buying those bonds. The Russians aren't buying those bonds. 90% of those bonds are being purchased with newly printed money from the Federal Reserve. Let me be clear. This is a way that you are taxed without representation. This is a way that everybody in this room is taxed. And I hear this all the time. People say, oh, but look, we're injecting liquidity, we're creating demand, and there's no inflation. I hear that from people on the other side of the aisle. There's no inflation. Where is the inflation? Look at the economy. Right now in our country, we are at a 50-year low for velocity of money. Banks are not lending. Why are banks not lending? Because when you print money to buy bonds, you drive up the demand for those bonds. And when you drive up the demand, you drive up the price, you drive down the interest rates. Interest rates are at record lows for record periods of time. Banks they're not incentivized to lend at 1 or 2% interest. So you've got artificially low interest rates, and of course you've got Dodd-Frank and you've got these bank examiners pushing banks to not lend. So banks aren't lending, businesses aren't borrowing. Why aren't businesses borrowing? Well, they don't want to borrow if they go over 50 employees, they're going to get caught up with Obamacare. And by the way, the regulations on businesses are horrific as well. So banks aren't lending, businesses aren't borrowing, individuals are deleveraging. So you're in a situation right now in our country where a 50-year velocity of money low, which means there's a ton of money sitting on the sidelines. If I were to create $1 trillion worth of liquidity, and I were to hand it to Ron here with the camera, who's gotten me in trouble from time to time. Not because of anything I said, by the way.
But he looks so sweet.
He does. But if I were to hand $1 trillion and the money were to be stuffed under a mattress, look, the liquidity has been created, but it hasn't entered the market, which means it will not affect the market. But the president says he wants the economy to heat up. Just stand by, watch what happens. When the economy heats up, the liquidity sitting on the sidelines will come into the market. You'll see massive amounts of inflation. And we've created the scenario that we saw in the 1970s where you had high inflation. That's what will happen. Now, the only thing the Federal Reserve can do at that point to try to control the inflation is to start selling the bonds that they've been buying. They sell the bonds, they get the greenbacks out of the market to try to control inflation. And when they do that, what are they doing? They're driving down the price of bonds because now there's an oversupply of bonds. They're driving up the interest rate. Now you've got high interest rates and high inflation. Does this ring a bell to some of the folks in the room that maybe bought a house in the 1970s? I talked to a couple recently. They bought a house, 21% interest the first time they bought a home. And by the way, inflation was really high back then as well. Now here's the scenario. High interest rates, high inflation. Where we are in our country now, that we weren't back in 1970s, right now we have $1 trillion annual deficit. We have a $17 trillion debt. And for every 1% increase in interest rates, it results in $500 billion in new deficit over 10 years. Every 1% increase in interest rates results in $500 billion in new deficit over 10 years. What this means is that we're not talking about 1% interest rate increases. We're talking about going back to 1970 interest rate increases. High inflation, high interest rates. So now you're going to have the Treasury selling bonds to fund the government, and at the same time the Federal Reserve selling bonds in order to try to hold down inflation. Now this scenario is very bleak, but there's a way we can control it. There's a way we can stop it. And that is to have members of Congress balance the budget, which is why I've always said I'm not going to vote for any debt ceiling increase unless there is a solution to balance the budget. Members of Congress don't see it that way. And now it appears that members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, don't see it that way. I'm going to finish with this. I'm tasked with talking about reining in federal government. And here's the basic foundational principle that everybody here needs to know. And I'm talking to the choir. I know that everybody here knows this. The reality is we have a Constitution that limits federal power. There are 17 enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8, and the 10th Amendment of the Constitution says the power is not delegated to the federal government by the states, it is retained to the states and the people. Remember, the states created the federal government. The federal government did not create the states. I've heard Nathan Don talk about this till he's blue in the face. The states have got to push back on this federal encroachment. The states have got to push back hard because it's not going to be solved by politicians in Washington, D.C. And those same framers that gave us the Constitution, they also gave us the Declaration of Independence. And we have inalienable rights. The first among them is the right to life. And if you don't have a very basic foundational right to life, what other rights are you expecting to receive from your government? The right to life is foundational to this country. It's part of our founding documents, and it needs to be, people need to talk about it. If the government can take away the right to life, there is no right they cannot take away. Last thing I'd like to talk about is this incentive structure. It was Milton Friedman. You guys are probably aware of Milton Friedman. He used to talk about how to change the incentive structure in Washington, D.C. And he said what you've got to do is you absolutely must create incentives. What he talked about, he talked about profits. He was an economist. How do you make it politically profitable? He said if you have the one person can make a decision one way or a different way based on what is politically profitable. He said the goal is to make it politically profitable for the wrong person to do the right thing. And that's what groups like this are doing. When you get Americans for Prosperity teaming with OCPA and the Tulsa 912 Project, you are incentivizing the wrong people to do the right thing because politicians are driven by getting reelected. And this group and the groups that are represented here are critically important to changing that incentive structure. I want to thank you for inviting me. I hope you guys do this again. I hope you do it frequently, and I hope that you always invite me. It's a pleasure to be here. I've got to get my son, who's here in the front row, I've got to get him to an 11 o'clock appointment. But God bless you, and God bless America. Thank you.